Child bride, bigamist, kidnap victim, and princess. Joan of Kent was all four. She was also the daughter of a traitor, the wife of the Black Prince, the mother of Richard II, supposedly the inspiration behind the name of the Order of the Garter, and a famed beauty known as the Fair Maid of Kent. In today's video from History Calling, and by popular demand, I've literally lost track of how many of you have asked me for a video on this woman, we're going to look at the remarkable life of the first Princess of Wales after its legal union with England, and a woman who should have been Queen. Joan was born in around 1328, the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, 1st Earl of Kent, and his wife Margaret Wake. On her father's side, she was related to the then King Edward III, for Edmund was the son of Edward I, half-brother of Edward II, and therefore the half-uncle of Edward III, making Joan the King's half-cousin. She had an older brother and sister named after their parents, but young Edmund died in 1333. The manner in which the 14-year-old Edward III had come to the throne in 1327 was very messy. His father, Edward II, had been dethroned, imprisoned, and forced to abdicate by his wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who assumed control of the government in the name of the new young king. Edward II had then died in captivity later that year, having very possibly been murdered. Joan's father had supported and initially profited from Isabella and Mortimer's takeover, but within 3 years his view on their new government had changed, and in 1330 he was found guilty of plotting to restore Edward II, who he had been duped into believing was still alive, and was executed on the 19th of March that year. Joan was barely 2 years old, yet now she was the daughter of a traitor. 3 weeks later, her mother gave birth to another son called John, and Joan, despite being a toddler, was made his godmother. She was not destined to be raised by Countess Margaret for long, however. In 1328, King Edward officially married Philippa of Hainault. There had already been proxy unions, and after Edmund's disgrace and death, the new queen, who was only around 15 to 20 years old, took Joan in, effectively adopting her. The little girl was raised at the royal court alongside the king and queen's own children, who included their eldest son, Edward, who was born in 1330 and later known as the Black Prince. He was also one of Joan's future husbands. The family went to Flanders in 1337 when Joan was around 9, and she may have travelled there with them. Whichever side of the English Channel she was on, though, in the spring of 1340, the girl, still aged only about 12, was to take an action which would sow the seeds of scandal. In the spring of that year, apparently the date was shortly before May, Joan was married for the first time. Usually in these sorts of videos, I'd be telling you right around now that this was an arranged match which was set up by her family and that the bride herself had nothing to do but show up to the church at the appointed time. But not so for our Joanie. No. She got married all by herself, and her husband was no wealthy landed magnate. Instead, he was Sir Thomas Holland, a member of the royal household and a career soldier, who was then aged about 25. Now, of course, from our point of view, she was still a child, so we could argue that she didn't really know what she was doing and that Thomas may have groomed her into this. But this situation still gives her more agency than the likes of Lady Margaret Beaufort had in the following century, when she was also married at 12 to Edmund Tudor, the brother of the then king, and a husband selected for her by her family. Joan and Thomas's marriage was conducted in considerable secrecy, with no banns read out beforehand and no priest to conduct the ceremony. But there were witnesses to the fact that they exchanged vows, and by the laws of the time, this, combined with later consummation, which Thomas said did occur, was enough to make the marriage valid. The bride's youth was no impediment either. In this time period, and for centuries afterwards, a girl was deemed old enough to wed at 12 and a boy at 14, just as long as there were no obstacles such as the pair being too closely related. Before we find out what happened next, if you're enjoying this content, please remember to give it a thumbs up so that YouTube knows you like it, and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that you never miss one of my uploads. You can also find me over on Instagram, where I post at least once a week, and on Patreon, where I provide bonus material including mini podcasts and early access to ad-free videos. To those of you who are already my patrons, thank you as always for your generous support, and the same goes to those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Within a few months of their clandestine wedding, Thomas was off soldiering in Prussia, which was a German state, and it was at that point that Joan's family did force her into an arranged marriage, this time to William Montagu, son of the Earl of Salisbury. We don't know for sure if Joan admitted to her marriage to Thomas before this second wedding, but it's possible she did and that her family persuaded her that the union wasn't valid. Either way, she was wed to William in early 1341 at the age of 12 or 13. Her husband was only 12, so we can assume that they weren't sleeping together yet because, like I said a moment ago, a marriage wasn't meant to be fully entered into until the groom was at least 14. When Thomas returned later that year, or possibly in 1342, there was little he could do about the situation, as Joan's new marriage had the blessing of the church and the king. He did apparently complain that she was in fact his wife, but it got him nowhere. The historian Karl P. Wentersdorf has attributed Holland's decision not to lodge a complaint with the ecclesiastical courts in England at this stage to the fact that he didn't believe he would get a fair hearing in that country, and his failure to make a complaint to the papal court in Avignon to the expense which would have been involved in doing so. Instead, over the next few years, he continued soldiering in mainland Europe, while Joan became the Countess of Salisbury in 1344 after her father-in-law died from jousting injuries. Funnily enough, Sir Thomas later became the steward of the new Lord Salisbury's household, so he presumably came into periodic contact with the young woman he still considered to be his wife. In 1346, the situation changed. Holland had been involved in the capture of Caen that summer, during which he had taken prisoner the French commander Count Raoul d'Eu. The following June, 1347, King Edward paid him 80,000 florins in exchange for the Count, thereby giving him, probably unwittingly, the financial ability to sue for the return of his wife through the papal courts. Pretty much immediately, Holland hired lawyers and began proceedings. A petition was sent to the Pope Clement VI, outlining the circumstances of the marriage, claiming that Joan had been coerced into her second union by her family, and saying that the young Lord Salisbury, aided and abetted by Joan's mother, Margaret, Dowager Countess of Kent, were keeping Sir Thomas from his lawful wife. Thomas had on his side the fact that, for reasons I'm not going to delve into here, the papacy and the King of England were not currently on good terms, so that even though Joan's second marriage had been made with the King and Queen's blessing, that didn't necessarily mean that the Pope or his Curia would find in Salisbury's favour. Cardinal Adhemar Robert was appointed to oversee the case and ordered William and Joan to come to Avignon to testify, or else send lawyers on their behalf. The young Earl of Salisbury had no intention of surrendering his countess, though, and he and his family now began to obfuscate matters in order to stall for time. His mother seems to have travelled to France in late 1347 to try to settle the matter, for instance, but to no avail. The 19-year-old Joan, meanwhile, was now effectively kidnapped by her second husband and in-laws. She was kept under guard, in isolation, although I'm sure she still had her servants, and denied the ability to talk to Sir Thomas and his lawyers, or to hire her own representation. When Thomas found out about this in early 1348, he made a further complaint to the Pope, as Joan would obviously be unable to come to Avignon as Clement had ordered, or send her own attorney. The Pope declared that Joan be allowed legal representation, but things moved painfully slowly, in part thanks to Salisbury's tactics, but also due to the distances involved between England and Avignon, which made travel and communication slow, and the fact that everybody was a bit distracted at the time by the Black Death, which was then ravaging Europe. It was the autumn of 1348 before a tribunal on the validity of the Holland marriage finally began. Evidence was heard from the witnesses to the wedding, and the lawyers for both sides were ordered to submit their claims and counterclaims. There followed more hearings and more efforts by Lord Salisbury to prevent Joan from being able to give her side of the story, so that it was 1349 before she was finally represented properly and able to share her memories of her first wedding. At this point, she confirmed, via her lawyer, that the first marriage had occurred and that she had entered into it willingly. Furthermore, she stated that the second wedding had taken place only because her family forced her into it and she feared the consequences if she refused their orders. Despite the continuing delaying tactics of Salisbury's lawyers, Cardinal Bernard Dalby, who had recently taken over the case from Cardinal Robert, found in Thomas Holland's favour. Joan's first marriage was declared valid, her second void, and Salisbury was ordered to return her to her real husband immediately. The decision was ratified by the Pope in a papal bull of November 1349, and Thomas and Joan were also ordered to be publicly wed as well. The now 21-year-old Joan, it seems, had been living in a state of bigamy and adultery since 1341. It was also during this marital upheaval that an event occurred which has since become associated with Joan: the founding of the Order of the Garter. This order was apparently created in 1348, there is some dispute over the exact year, by Edward III, and according to historian Polydore Virgil, writing in the early 16th century, it was so named because at court one day, Edward picked up from the floor a garter that had loosened and dropped from the leg of the queen or of his mistress, as sometimes happens. Some of his nobles saw this and made a joke at his expense, and he told them it would soon come to pass that such a garter would be held in the highest honour by them. Then, not much later, he founded this order, and gave it this title to attest that his nobles had not judged him rightly. You'll note that Virgil didn't mention Joan of Kent here, nor can I be sure that she was associated with this tale until much later. Virgil actually said that English sources didn't include this story, for English authors, bashful and perhaps afraid of exposing themselves to accusations of lèse-majesté for reporting something so undignified, preferred to let it pass in silence. Now, I did find a claim that this story could be pushed back to the 1460s. However, the book I would have needed to get in order to check this reference cost £60, and I'm afraid I wasn't prepared to purchase it just for that. I'll leave it linked below for you though, in case any of you are interested. I therefore don't know for sure if this possible earlier reference mentioned Joan or not, or just followed the same line as Virgil's work by attributing the garter to some unspecified woman at court. I did find a review of the book in question, however, which seems to suggest that the story from the 1460s didn't name Joan. What I can say for sure, however, is that any association with her was not widely known about in the early 16th century. So how did her name end up becoming so heavily identified with this story? The best explanation I can give you is that it was an oral tradition which eventually made its way into the popular written record as the story of the order's foundation morphed over time. In 1614, for instance, the writer John Selden wrote that some and the most part affirm that the king dancing with the queen, or rather the Countess of Salisbury, whom he much affected, a garter fell from her. The king took it up and wore it on his leg, and, whether upon the queen's jealousy or the lords merry observing it, told them, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," this means shame on him who thinks ill of it, and is the motto of the order, and that he would make it the most honourable garter that ever was worn. This reference to the Countess of Salisbury, made about 266 years after the order was instigated, is the best known reason for the connection to Joan, as she held that title during her second marriage. But you'll note that Selden can offer no concrete tie between the Countess and the Garter story, and in fact admits that he is just repeating popular gossip. He even goes on to offer an alternative reason for the name of the order, saying, others think the garter was used for some symbol before his successful battle. Later in the 17th century, Richard Baker, in his Chronicle of the Kings of England, repeated much the same story that Selden had produced, saying it was either the garter of the Queen or of Joan, Countess of Salisbury, which inspired the name of the order. Again, however, there was no proof, and he could only cite common opinion, admitting that it was only some people who even said the anecdote related to Joan. Like Selden, he likewise offered an entirely different explanation too, saying that the name might have come from the fact that, in a battle wherein he, Edward III, was victorious, he had given the word garter for the word or sign. He added too that others thought the order actually dated to the time of Richard I and had simply become more famous during Edward's reign. In other words, he was admitting that he didn't know where it originated and that there were many theories. By the 18th century, people were beginning to catch on to the fallacy of this story, and writer Elias Ashmole gave an excellent rebuttal of it in 1714. Speaking of the theories around the order's foundation, he first related the same tale given by Selden, then said, "But upon examination of this tradition, let others judge what credit it bears to establish its belief. For Sir John Froissart," this was a French chronicler who I would usually call Jean de Froissart, "the only writer of the age that treats of this institution, assigns no such original, nor for 200 years after is there anything to the purpose in our other historians, till Polydore Virgil took occasion to say something of it, but had it been fact, some French historian or other would not have neglected to register it." In the original statutes of this order, there is not the least conjecture to countenance the conceit of such a feminine institution, no, not so much as laying an obligation on the knights' companions to defend the quarrels of ladies, as some orders then in being enjoined, nor doth the author of that tract entitled Institutio Clarissima Ordinis Militaris a Pre Nobile Subligaculo Nuncupati, preface to the Black Book of the Garter, let fall the manifest passage to ground it on. Ashmole then noted, as I have already done, that Joan's name was not mentioned by Virgil, who merely said the woman in question was the king's wife or mistress, and it didn't appear until Selden used it. He then tears Selden's argument apart, saying that there was never any indication that Edward III had Joan as a mistress, and that Selden's description of her as the Countess of Kent and Salisbury is inaccurate, though I must say I didn't see Selden call her the Countess of Kent, so that might be an error on Ashmole's part. He explains his accusation of incorrect titling by saying, "About the time when this order was founded, she in truth was dignified with neither honour, for although she was daughter to Thomas of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, and had been sometime the reputed wife of William Montagu, 2nd Earl of Salisbury, yet then she could not properly be accounted Countess of Salisbury. She was actually wife to Sir Thomas Holland, one of the first founders of the order. Nor was she yet, though afterwards, Countess of Kent, because her brother, John, Earl of Kent, at the institution of this order, survived, and died not till 26 Edward III, that means 26th year of the reign of Edward III, and we'll come back to her brother's death in a minute. So gang, to sum up, there's no contemporary evidence that Joan had anything to do with the Order of the Garter's name. No one suggested that she did until at least the 1460s, and by the early 18th century that suggestion was being soundly rebuffed. Furthermore, at all points in the story, writers were also ready to admit that there were several other theories as to where the name had come from. So now that we've dealt with that, let's get back to her biography. Between 1349 and 1360, Joan's family expanded and contracted. Her mother, who had inherited the title Baroness Wake from her own brother, Joan's uncle, died in September 1349, and Joan's sister was dead by December 1352, for in that month her remaining brother John passed away as well, just as Elias Ashmole said in that quote I just read out to you. As John had no heirs at this point, Joan inherited the titles Countess of Kent and Baroness Wake in her own right. Sir Thomas was then able to use them thanks to his position as her husband, and so he is described in some documents as the Earl of Kent. Had her elder sister still been alive at this stage, it would have been she who inherited the titles. Joan and Thomas Holland had 5 children. A younger Thomas, born in 1350, John in around 1352 or 1353, Edmund in 1354, who died as an infant, Joan in 1356, and Maud in 1359. Records are scarce for this period of her life, however, and for the most part we don't know where she was or what she was doing on a day-to-day basis. She likely spent some time in France, however, as her husband was appointed Lieutenant of Brittany by Edward III, then Governor of the Channel Islands, and eventually Captain General of France and Normandy in 1359. It is this final appointment which explains why it was in Normandy that Thomas died on the 28th of December 1360, leaving Joan a widow at the age of around 32. This is where Edward, Prince of Wales, known to history as the Black Prince, re-enters the story. At the time, King Edward was trying to arrange a marriage for his eldest son, who somewhat unusually for a man of his age and rank was still unwed at the age of 30, to Margaret of Flanders. However, the prince quickly surprised everyone in the spring of 1361 by secretly marrying his half-cousin once removed, Joan, Countess of Kent. It was her third marriage and her second clandestine wedding. Even if he did love her, and he seems to have done so, the prince's choice was nevertheless astonishing, given her checkered marital past, the fact that one of her husbands was still living, and her age, for being in her early 30s made her old for childbearing by the standards of the day, particularly when we consider that she would be required to produce a male heir, and obviously didn't have as much time to do so as a teenage bride would. On the other hand, she was rich, immediately available, clearly fertile, and famously beautiful. Jean de Froissart called her, in her time, the fairest and loveliest of all England's kings, and the most amorous. The poet known as the Chandos Herald said she was beautiful, pleasant, and wise. It is therefore not hard to see why she was later given the moniker the Fair Maid of Kent. However, much like Edward's title, the Black Prince, this name does not seem to have been used during her lifetime. See my video on the story behind his nickname to learn about the confusion surrounding when and why it emerged. The new royal marriage caused some immediate problems. People related to each other as closely as this pair were not supposed to wed, and the prince was godfather to Joan's eldest son, which was viewed as another barrier under church law at the time. They ought to have had a papal dispensation to get around these problems before the marriage, but given the speedy and very private nature of the wedding, they did not. In fact, the haste with which they married has had historians scratching their heads for centuries, as they have tried to ascertain how this union came about. The two had of course known each other since childhood, and there has been speculation that the entry in Prince Edward's accounts for a silver beaker to his cousin Jeanette in 1348 was a sign of his love for her. According to Richard Barber, writing the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, some French chroniclers, quote, produced a fanciful romance telling of the unspoken love of Joan for the prince and of the prince for Joan, and of the king's subsequent fury, end quote. But the truth is, we really don't know how or when this attachment formed, or the king's immediate reaction. The fact that the wedding was held in secret and so soon after Joan's widowhood certainly suggests that she and the prince knew there would be objections, but as Barber goes on to point out, Edward III seems to have supported it very quickly, though that might be because he had no choice by that stage. Together with his heir, he retroactively sought the necessary dispensation, which was granted on the 7th of September. This freed the couple from the threat of excommunication and told them to establish 2 chapels within a year as penance. It also stated that Joan's annulment from Salisbury be double-checked to make absolutely sure that her children with the prince would be legitimate, another indication of the dodgy situation her marital history left her in, and why she wasn't the ideal candidate to marry the man expected to be the future king. No further problems were found, and a month later the couple were formally betrothed in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury. On the 10th of October, they were publicly married at Windsor in front of the royal family, including the King and Queen. For those of you keeping track, Joan had now had 3 husbands and 5 weddings. Furthermore, while there had been princesses or ladies of Wales prior to its union with England, Joan was the first woman ever to hold the title Princess of Wales as the wife of the heir to the English throne. She certainly acted the part of princess in terms of her expenditure, for she was famously extravagant and enjoyed beautiful clothes and jewels. In the summer of 1363, she and her children accompanied her husband to Aquitaine, of which he had been made the prince by his father in July 1362, and so Joan could now add the title Princess of Aquitaine to the roster of honours she already held. They would stay in their new home for 8 years, with Joan apparently based mainly in Bordeaux and Angoulême. The sources don't tell us where she was all the time, so this assumption is just based on the information we do have. Whilst there, she produced 2 royal children, and fortunately for her, they were both boys. Another Prince Edward was born in 1365 in Angoulême, and Richard of Bordeaux followed in January 1367, when Joan was about 39 years old. The love between the boys' parents was evident in their correspondence and to those who saw them. In a surviving letter from the elder Prince Edward to Joan, he calls her his dearest companion, and in 1367, when he returned from campaigning in Spain, we are told by the Chandos Herald that his wife met him at Bordeaux Cathedral with their children, and that as they made their way to the bishop's palace where they were staying, they walked together holding hands. It was not all happiness, however, for Joan's mother-in-law, Queen Philippa, died in 1369, and her elder royal son passed away in 1370, leaving little Richard as second in line to the throne. The following year, the family returned to England. The health of the so-called Black Prince was now beginning to fail. He seems to have suffered from repeated attacks of dysentery, and over the next 5 years, Joan would sometimes deputise for him to reduce his workload. To quote the Oxford DNB again, she wrote to thank the City of London for a gift of plate made to him in 1371 and went without him to Queen Philippa's anniversary service in August that year. Despite what she must have hoped, though, the prince never did recover his health, and in 1376 the end came. On the 7th of June he made his will, and the next day he died at Westminster Palace and just a week shy of his 46th birthday. Any chance of Joan becoming queen died with him. At his own request, he was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where he had founded the 2 chapels demanded by the Pope after his illicit marriage to his princess, and this impressive monument to him was later erected. The following year, his father, Edward III, was dead too, and Joan's 10-year-old son ascended to the throne as Richard II. Unsurprisingly, given his youth, the king's mother held great sway with him and could often secure pardons and grants for her favourites. The princess appeared at state functions too, including a lavish entertainment at the king's home, Kennington Palace, in 1379, which was hosted by the people of London. She also lived through one of the most tumultuous events of her young son's reign, the Peasants Revolt of 1381. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked into a history of the revolt here, but just for the sake of context, I'll tell you that it wasn't just peasants who were involved in it, despite the name, and that it was sparked by a poll tax, though there were other long-term factors leading to it as well, including the continued existence of serfdom in England at the time. The rebels, who were led by Wat Tyler, were involved in many acts of violence in England during the summer of 1381, including attacks on major buildings in London during which senior members of the government were murdered. One such attack was on the Tower of London, where Joan was sheltering. The king had left her there while he went to negotiate with another group of protesters elsewhere in the city, and with the gates open for his expected return, the rebels were able to effectively walk in. It was an incredibly dangerous situation. Other prominent persons in the Tower that day were slaughtered. But Joan remained a popular figure, and after the insurgents jokingly invited the Dowager Princess of Wales to kiss them, they left her alone. Richard and his forces eventually managed to put down the revolt and kill most of its leaders. The following year, Joan saw her young son married to Anne of Bohemia, and in 1384 she lost her daughter, also called Joan, who was by then the Duchess of Brittany. By that point, the princess's health had begun to fail, and she put on so much weight that she could barely stand. Nevertheless, she continued to play a role in public affairs, trying to heal breaches between the king and his uncle, John Duke of Lancaster, and also between Richard and his half-brother, John Holland. In June 1385, the king went to Scotland, leaving his mother with a bodyguard of knights to protect her in his absence, but she wouldn't need them for long. Clearly very ill, Joan made her will on the 8th of August that year and asked to be buried not with her third husband at Canterbury Cathedral, but with her first, Sir Thomas Holland, in Stamford. When she expired on the 14th of that same month at Wallingford Castle, aged about 57, her wishes were duly carried out, though she wasn't interred until the 27th of January 1386, when the king returned. It had been quite a life, and Joan was quite a woman. From the disgraced daughter of a traitor to a countess, then a princess, and the mother of the king, she'd shown that she was far more than a pretty face. Even as a young girl, she'd proven herself prepared to take the initiative and make her own choices when it came to her marriages, defying the expectations of the day and risking severe consequences. And she'd proven her worth too as a consort to Prince Edward and a guiding hand to Richard II. Let me know in the comments below what you make of her. And until next time, keep learning.